such a pleasure to see you here in Colorado again, and I'm very excited about our conversation. I thought maybe we could talk. We both have this fascinating dual role, which is we both spent kind of the early part of our lives just curious and obsessed with books and pursuing vocational philosophy, and then gradually over our lives have kind of gotten pulled into more societal vocations. And it'd be interesting to talk about that. What was the thing that initially drew you into philosophy? How does that work? And then we can talk about the social
Oh,
stuff.
that's a fantastic question. So I was really interested in understanding the fundamental nature of reality. And
Yeah.
I thought math was the way to do that. I thought that the world is actually built up of physics, which gives us chemistry, which gives biology, which gives psychology, but back beyond physics was mathematics. And if only I could understand the structure of mathematics, then I could understand the structure of the world. And you start studying mathematics and you realize there's a set of
Yeah.
associated philosophical questions.
Yeah.
What's the nature of truth? What is it that we're doing when we're trying to represent the world? What is the world that we're trying to represent? What's
Yeah.
the relation between experience and reality?
Yeah.
And that sent me off
Yeah.
on philosophy, and I spent a couple decades
Yeah.
just doing that.
Yeah.
How about you?
I mean, I think a pretty similar story. I grew up here, actually in the mountains, and had, I think, always this sense of like depth and resonance to the world, and this feeling that you could start studying anything and it would just pull you into deeper and deeper pools. And the question of what those pools were and how um, they all hold together in some fashion, or maybe don't, like was, I think, an obsession probably since the time I was a teenager. As soon as I started getting into higher education, like I just found all of these friends in people, but also especially in books, that are also just totally obsessed with that. Like there's a like sometimes you pick up a book and you realize, oh, this person like salivates in the same way I do. And I think that just drove me into, you know, it's a funny way to spend your 20s or 30s, like just in libraries reading. But on the other hand, my experience is that that's the place where I found the biggest world, actually. And it's like a kind of adventure, and you know, the same feeling that I have when I'm doing backcountry running or skiing here and reading Plato or Goethe. Like it feels like it's the same thing. And I think that the question of this, it feels to me like a lot of people are actually struggling with the world feeling too small
Yeah.
and not quite sure how to cope with that. And one of the things that I think makes us, I don't feel that very much, is just how much philosophy has kind of gotten in for me.
I would
Yeah.
say what I experience in philosophy is a kind of capaciousness and generality. I'm
Yeah.
interested
Yeah.
in lots and lots of specifics.
Yeah.
And it's not that I lack an interest in very particular things, like
Yeah.
what color am I going to
Yeah.
paint my nails?
Yeah. Yeah.
At
To
the
take a random
same, to
example.
take a random example,
Yeah.
and these are
Delightful.
Pantone
Yeah.
Max Aspen colors. But in addition, I feel grounded, and I would even say undergrounded.
Yeah.
That is, I feel like what it is to have engaged seriously with a set of philosophical
Yeah.
questions is to keep going without stopping to look and answer two
Yeah.
questions in full generality. One,
Yeah.
how are these two things the same? Two, how are these two things different?
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I mean, I think, well, I mean, this kind of gets to the second part of the conversation I want to have, which is about how this relates to kind of places that are outside of intellectual circles. One of the things that has really meant a lot for me is that I think that the more that you do that generality, there are like obviously like things that can be very, very specific and very technical, and you want to be extremely intellectually careful about, but it's also somehow more hospitable, I feel. Like there's a way that as you pursue what is the meaning of life, why do we have a society at all, what is the kind of relationship between consciousness and the world, suddenly those are questions that everyone already feels and is asking in some kind of visceral way. And I think my earliest experiences of this were with teaching students, where I taught at like a fairly a university in a fairly poor part of England for my first job, and University of Nottingham, which is kind of like sort of parallel to the American Rust Belt in a certain way. And so you have all of these kids that are first generation in college, or not quite sure how they're going to relate to like their kind of long-term career. Very different than elite universities where I've taught. And the experience of like sitting at a seminar table, they're all nervous. You've given them hard books to read, but in that first session, you get to say like, no, no, I actually really want to know what you think about life. Like, what is it? How does that resonate for you? What is the meaning of this? And I think watching the instant sense of enthusiasm, or there's like something that switches, like, oh, like this is a kind of empowerment that I haven't had before. And I think there's there's something that philosophy is able to do in that way that feels very different to me than a lot of other academic disciplines. Like in a time when we have all of this like tension with elite context where people feel like they're being told they're stupid. There's something about philosophy that feels humble. I don't know what your experience
Yeah,
of this
so
has
it's
been.
interesting. I grew up in a faith tradition. My father was a rabbi, and
Huh.
I had this experience from very, very early on that the idea was to take a really complicated, subtle, powerful, in this case, sacred
Yeah,
text, get together as a community every week with an assigned bit of it. The Jewish tradition
yeah,
works through the 5 books of Moses over a 1 year
yeah,
cycle.
yeah,
And then take something which was meant to be fully general, right? This is the word of the divine that applies to all and in a
yeah,
particular way
yeah,
to this particular people.
yeah,
And ask every single person, right? It doesn't work in a synagogue setting. It doesn't work in a church setting. It doesn't work in any faith setting
yeah.
if any individual is left out. It
Right,
is
right.
supposed to be
Yeah,
universal.
capacious. Yeah.
So I was very early on exposed
Huh.
to the idea that the most complicated and important and powerful texts
Hmm.
had to be made available
Yeah,
to everybody,
yeah,
or we had
yeah,
failed in our divine duty.
yeah. Do you feel like that? Like when you think about the hospitality of that, does it feel like that's kind of? It seems like it contrasts a lot with the spirit of our time, where people are constantly getting pulled into smaller bubbles, where they're like enforcing their own perspective or ideology very fiercely. That sense of like breaking it into a larger community that's instantly hospitable feels different.
So I mean, faith manifests itself in different ways.
Yeah,
And I grew up in a relatively liberal faith tradition,
yeah,
which was about identifying without identifying the ways in which a text was relevant to me
yeah. Right,
without
right,
fully altering myself to match the text,
right,
though that was part of what was being asked.
right.
There are a lot of faith traditions that involve the presentation of an answer, the expectation that
Yeah,
one needs to accept that view of the world to
yeah,
be part of them.
yeah,
Those, for me, feel less philosophically amenable, though
yeah,
I do think living a life structured by the feeling that there are answers to
yeah,
the most important questions is
yeah.
a really powerful way to live a life.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. Yeah, yeah, obviously. Maybe we talk a little bit about like kind of what we've been thinking societally.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
both of our work has pulled us into these things. For me, I run this research center at Aspen called Philosophy and Society, which is very much about how do you take this kind of like the deeper thing that we've both been salivating over and then make it accessible in a way that's just broadly attractive to people. And I think that is like a kind of an empowering I think that's come out of that sense that like whatever this is has a kind of curiosity that's accessible for people all over the place.
Yeah.
But you're dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale and a philosopher. You've been doing all kinds of funny, interesting, fascinating experiments with public philosophy.
Yeah.
Talk maybe about how that started and then how it's been
Yeah,
going.
so I, about 15 years ago, was invited to speak at something called One Day University, which is sort of an Aspen Junior for the East Coast. And I was asked to put together a lecture for curious adults
Yeah,
who wanted to engage with something serious. And I had this idea that I could use the structure that religion uses,
yeah,
which is I could take some hard texts that really meant a lot
yeah,
and that I thought addressed fundamental features of human experience.
yeah,
And I could basically give a sermon about them, right? I am
yeah,
telling you this particular parable,
yeah.
except this particular parable happened to be an excerpt from Aristotle's
Yeah,
Ethics.
that's great.
Or this particular parable happened to be a Thomistic
Yeah,
discussion of a particular distinction.
yeah,
But rather than doing the riff
yeah,
in the sermon simply on the basis of a contemporary topic,
yeah,
I decided also to embed it in my second area of academic specialization, which is cognitive science.
Yeah.
And
Right.
to look for a way in which whatever it was that Plato or Epictetus was talking about was also part of a contemporary exploration using neuroscience or
Yeah.
using game theory
Yeah.
to show the continuity of these topics
Yeah.
and then to make them specifically applicable to
Yeah.
people's lives.
Yeah.
So that became a project. I ended up taking a full year off from teaching to be a full-time student to learn enough neuroscience and other cognitive science to know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And then I put together a course that I taught at Yale called Philosophy and the Science of Human Nature, which was 26 Dead Guy Tuesday, Cog Sci Thursday lectures. And it's had like 500,000 viewers.
Yeah.
And I thought,
Yeah.
this is
Great.
really fun.
It's great.
And I began to participate in things like Aspen, and I've
Yeah.
done a number of your society initiatives.
Yeah.
And now I am working on a project which I call Public Plato, which is really thinking seriously about how to embed the insights that I have
Yeah.
in all sorts of new technologies. So
Yeah.
I taught a course last spring where my students literally made TikToks of Plato on parts of the soul. And we thought about how short form and long form
Yeah.
and various kinds of storytellings could let us do this.
Yeah.
And so the Public Plato project
Yeah.
is a multimedia attempt. I'm doing a Coursera course right now,
Yeah.
just to see, can I help other people see how deeply powerful these texts have been for
Yeah.
me? I explain it to every single one of my Uber drivers.
Yeah.
I explain it to
Right, right.
any person I encounter because I believe these are universal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I think one of the things that has driven me into this, I mean, I got pulled into the kind of public facing things after Brexit and after Trump, that it felt like there's just this kind of sense of the society being unsettled, but actually like almost exactly in the way that our discipline had been reflecting on it for, I mean, 3 decades or something within the academy, and very little of that was getting out. We have the Surgeon General here at Ideas
Yeah.
Festival, and he's done this advisory. I think very beautifully tried to bring to public attention this idea that loneliness and the kind of unhappiness people are feeling is a relevant public issue. And I think that there's something similar that I find in philosophy, that I think the danger of the Surgeon General stuff a little bit is that it can get pulled into narrow public health context. It's not about life as a whole, it's just about how you're feeling. And I think there's something, the generality of, wait, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? How do other people feel unsettled the same way I do? There's a kind of community aspect to that I find really moving and lovely. And I think that's the kind of thing, again, like, I think the experience of being a student of these things, suddenly you find, oh, everyone else is curious about these things too. And it gives like a context for vulnerability
Yeah.
of a certain kind that I find moving. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am moved by the way in which the ritual structure of faith traditions
Yeah.
actually makes it easy to focus on big things,
Yeah.
but not lose the world.
Right.
So the faith tradition that I'm part of basically says every time you eat something,
Yeah.
pay attention to the fact that the world around you provides you with sustenance
Yeah.
in a way that is an
Yeah.
extraordinary blessing.
Yeah.
And it says, once a week,
great.
slow down and think about some stuff.
Yeah.
So the view that I think about philosophical questions
Yeah.
is not that I never do
No.
updates to my Facebook page.
Yeah.
It's not that
Yeah.
I never
Yeah.
plan outfits with
No,
my
no.
incredibly stylish daughter.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that, in addition, because I was raised this way, I really do either say a quiet blessing before eating
Yeah.
or feel bad about not having done so.
Yeah.
And that in itself
Yeah.
is a value.
It allows, there's like a kind of quiet respect to that. I think that, like you're talking about with Sabbath, like the capacity to have lots of your week dedicated to insurance policies, but then something that just says stop. Like you can do that on Thursday. There are other days also. And there's a kind of dignity to that, I think, that is really lovely. And I do think that rule of life, one of the things that we have started developing is a philosophy salon, where we try very hard to get very wide, a very heterogeneous group of people together, people who are from different classes and different disciplines and different ideologies. So we usually do it in DC, where you have like, Senate Republicans will never talk to anyone who's a Democrat, and like just and try to have all of those people, but then have it protected enough that people are able to be vulnerable and honest in a certain way. Our main strategy there has been to debate one word that's like bigger than everyone's day job. So this feeling, so we've done words like tragedy, self, democracy. They're like the kinds of things that everyone doesn't know what they mean, and so then it unlocks some of that kind of pattern of, I don't know, arrogance that you kind of already know the nature of the world before you come to it. And I think one of the things I've found in that context, which I think resonates very much with what you're saying about faith traditions, is that they kind of decenter the feeling like you just have to, like the meaning of life is for you to be successful.
Yes.
Like that sort of gets unseated because you think, oh no, there's so many beautiful things that are more important than just whether I've been able to ascend this career ladder.
So, I mean, Aristotle says you should always aim for the mean between extremes.
Right. Yeah.
And we have lots of structures in society that let us play to the extreme of our competitiveness.
Yeah.
I love winning games. I love winning arguments. I just don't mind winning things. And so I have a space in which I indulge my desire for competition.
Yeah.
And building a structure on the other side,
Yeah.
which does, in fact, the opposite of that
Yeah.
and builds my connection, builds my humility.
Yeah.
It's really like the
Yeah.
analog to
Yeah.
practicing tennis.
Yeah. I love this. No, I mean, William James has this famous essay called "The Moral Equivalence of War," where he thinks like you need to actually be honest about your nature, and part of that is like this kind of intense competitive aspect, but you can have context for that are not as destructive, and that has like a kind of human resonance to it. But then it also allows there to be these contexts that have contemplation and all these other features to them that seem really important. Yeah, I mean, so I'm curious, as you're like now watching the kind of larger social setting that we're embedded in,
Yeah.
and especially I think generations that are coming up, what are the kinds of just a couple of the insights that you think from philosophy can actually like hit that social mood in a way that's actually fruitful, that are different than what people are getting elsewhere?
Yeah, so I have been really shaped in recent years by my reading of the Stoics and particularly of the philosopher Epictetus. And I actually had the opportunity this fall to teach Epictetus's handbook to a group of men who were incarcerated in the maximum security prison in Connecticut through a program that Yale runs. And the realization that the way in which you interpret experience has as much effect on you as the experience does, that the contribution that it makes to your mental self is actually jointly determined by the world and your interpretation of it. It's an incredibly powerful understanding to have. The single sentence takes a single sentence to understand. The actuality of it takes a lifetime to understand. And I found every single group with whom I explore that idea finds meaning in it. The second is that there is a very real reflection in pretty much all of Western philosophy that, as you said about William James, we are complex beings. We are rational. We care about our social approbation. We are interested in bodily pleasure. We gain joy from certain kinds of dominance. We gain joy from certain kinds of being led around. All of those things are very real and human. Ancient philosophy spends a good part of its effort trying to figure out how to get that multi-part soul into harmony. And I would say that's a second really general lesson, the recognition that every single human being is, as Aristotle would say, both rational, that is capable of thought, and an animal, that is capable of feeling and suffering.
And I mean, again, I think that really resonates with what we've been saying all along, which is that there's a feature of this which is just about what it is to be human, and everyone has that problem. Like, we all get born, we don't really know what the world is, we don't know what we are, and we're not really sure how we're supposed to behave. Like, we just sort of clumber around, and the capacity to develop those questions in the context of a community like feels just very, very rich and meaningful.
And it can be scary to do it, right? The remark you gave, we all just clumber around. I mean, one of the ways in which a rigid social structure is helpful is that it gives you an answer to every question. It's part of the appeal of fundamentalist religion. It's part of the appeal of a particularly structured society. And it's perfectly reasonable to live a life structured
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
answers that are given to you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my guess is that even that life
Yeah.
will be made more fulfilling
Yeah.
by sometimes thinking about why.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. This has been delightful. It's so good to see you in Aspen, and I am really grateful to be able to have such a like kind of deep resonance in the things that we care about. So,
Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Sam. Really, really my pleasure.
Yeah.